Since introduction to the area in 1966, the Class 37s have always been associated with the freight traffic of South Wales. Today, Cardiff Canton Traction Maintenance Depot has almost 100 examples on its books, making this by far the largest single concentration of Class 37 motive power in the country. Most of Cardiff's locomotives are dedicated to the rail freight sector. Despite the decline of many of South Wales' traditional industries over the last decades, coal and steel traffic still predominate in South Wales, as the following scenes testify. As already mentioned, a number of the class were refurbished and classified 37-4s for working on passenger traffic. All further refurbished machines were intended for freight work, and a complicated numbering system was adopted for locomotives chosen for refurbishment to distinguish them from Phase 1 and Phase 2 machines, as well as to differentiate between brush and GEC alternator-fitted locomotives. The refurbishment program for these dedicated rail freight locomotives commenced in 1986. This particular example, 37697, is a Phase 2 locomotive, being one of a batch of 33, numbered 37667 to 37699, and fitted with brush alternators. The line to Maesteg is the only route to remain at this once busy junction at Tondu. Here, lines run south and west to connect with the main coastal route. The heavy loads of coal are often moved on steep gradients, and the Class 37s are used to the limits. This particular example is undergoing load testing on the line to Aberdare. 37889 is a ballasted Phase 2 locomotive and is equipped with brush equipment. A number of these Phase 2 locomotives have been experimentally fitted with Merleys or Ruston power units and have been classified 37-9. At the time, this was part of the process of evaluation for British Rail's future motive power fleet. The main east to west route in South Wales sees a large and varied number of freight movements. Ebor Junction to the west of Newport is a point where a number of lines diverge to the port and valleys. The movement of coal still comprises a major part of the freight movements. Some of this traffic has now been containerized. Cardiff Central lies at the hub of the freight lines serving South Wales, and as such sees a considerable number of workings. At one time, Cardiff was the world's largest coal exporting port. Today, although much coal traffic still passes through the docks, the proportion is tiny compared with past decades. Upon refurbishment of the 37s, a small number of external alterations were apparent. Certainly the most noticeable was to the Phase 1 locomotives, which lost their most endearing feature, the split headcode boxes. These locomotives, as a result, received a much plainer front-end design with marker lights fitted. In comparison, these Phase 2 locomotives retained their original headcode, and as such, their appearance remains much as it has been for the whole of their lives. As well as providing the British steel plants at Llanwern and Margam with the majority of their raw materials, much of the produce of these two establishments is also forwarded by rail. Between them, Llanwern and Margam produce about 95,000 tons of steel each week, of which the majority is hot rolled coils. These coils travel the short distance by rail to Ebervale and Trostre, whilst the longer traffic flow takes them via the north and west route to Schotten. In addition, a large amount of steel is also exported through Newport docks. At one time, these trains provided triple-headed Class 37 haulage and were the heaviest trains on the network. In latter times, pairs of Class 56s were employed, but recently haulage has reverted to Class 37 motive power, this time in pairs. Most of the South Wales coalfield production feeds the British steel complexes in this area. The freight scene in South Wales will continue to be dominated by the 37s for some years to come. The delightfully scenic cross-country route from Crewe to South Wales via Shrewsbury and Hereford provides a superb backdrop to the class on both passenger and freight. Some passenger duties are still 37 operated, utilising the relatively small Cardiff Canton 37-4 allocation. These passenger workings are very much on borrowed time, and the shortage of Sprinter DMUs is directly responsible for their longevity. A midday train leaves Shrewsbury bound for Cardiff. The route also sees a number of steel coil trains moving some of the produce of Llanwern and Margam steelworks to Shotton on Deeside. Steel coil is also imported to South Wales from Ravenscraig in Scotland, and these trains are also routed over the north and west. These coil trains regularly utilise the Merleys and Ruston powered Class 37-9 variant. When introduced, the livery of these Type 3s was standard British Rail Brunswick green. The first 20 locomotives were delivered without the familiar yellow warning panel, which was later decreed necessary for safety reasons. Locomotives from D6720 carried this feature from new. Later in life, locomotives began to receive full yellow front ends, as well as re-livery into the now familiar rail blue. Some examples, including initially all the 37-4 variant, received large logo livery with extended yellow ends.
Locomotive haulage along the Rumney Valley goes back to 1994. In the early days, Waterman Railways provided Class 47s. Then, in June 1998, the 50 Fund provided 50031 Hood. It's seen at Cardiff Central preparing to collect empty stock. There were two locomotive diagrams at this time. The second is seen worked by 37416. It's followed by the Class 50, which is also bringing in empty stock. In early 1999, Railtrack decided that preserved locomotives could not work regular service trains, and EWS Class 37s were brought in. 2005 was to be the last year for locomotive haulage along the valleys. The exploits of the remaining Class 37s have been followed closely. The large logo 37425 was to work a special from Cardiff to North Wales in conjunction with the Crewe Open Weekend of September. It's seen on the outward journey to Crewe and then on to Chester. Later, the large logo 37 returns south. We'll now take a look at the Class 37s in their final weeks of operation throughout the route from Cardiff to Rumney. We'll start with EWS liveried 37405. This is one of 3 diagrams on the line on Saturdays, worked from a pool of 4 locomotives. All the 37-4s, with the exception of 37-404, have worked the Rumney services at some time. In addition, many other 37s have plied the route. This is a southbound working approaching the summit near Caerphilly Tunnel. This northbound working is heading through the Cardiff suburbs. Cardiff Central is well lit, ideal for night photography. This southbound train has just emerged from Caerphilly Tunnel. line is single track north of Bargoed. Next, we'll feature the large Logo 37. This was turned out in this livery from Toten workshops in the spring of 2005. "37-425 worked the first trial run along the route 11 years ago. Then it carried train load construction colours, followed by regional railways and then EWS red livery. At Cardiff Central, empty stock is brought in from the carriage sidings. This is a southbound train on the final approach to Cardiff. Next we feature the green liveried 37, the result of another repaint at Towton in May 2005. The approach to Pontlottyn offered some of the best vantage points on the line. On Sunday the 4th of December, a special day of loco-hold operations was held on the Rumney line, with hired-in traction in addition to the usual Class 37s. We'll now feature this event, starting with the first trains of the day from Rumney. These were to run at 15 minutes past the hour throughout the day. A Class 47 and a Class 33 were hired in from West Coast Rail. With the exception of the morning and evening trains, services were top and tailed. "50-031 was to work these trains in the late 1990s. Trains stopped only at Bargoed and Caerphilly. Timings were the same as with the stopping services, so it's not surprising that trains ran early. Three sets of stock were in use. In addition, train locos were marshalled to give each locomotive a turn leading on the uphill journey. Now some evening turns at Caerphilly. The following weekend came the end of locomotive haulage along the valleys, and the end of an era for the days of regular locomotive hauled services. The last day of locomotive haulage was Saturday, the 10th of December. We'll now take a look at the end of a remarkable chapter of traction.
The announcement in 1955 of the British Railways modernisation plan led to the introduction of hundreds of then new diesel locomotives over the next decade. Many of these first-generation diesels are themselves now part of history. But one class, the English Electric Type 3, referred to nowadays under the TOPS classification as Class 37, have outlived many of their equally venerable shedmates, and even today are still giving front-line service throughout the British Rail network. The origins of Class 37 can be traced back to the last years of the big four railway companies, when the LMS and Southern Railway were both constructing what was then the very first mainline diesel prototypes in the country. From these prototypes came the well-known and popular Type 4 designs, the English Electric Class 40 and the Sulzer Type 4s, known as the Class 44s, 45s and 46. Sadly, apart from a small number of examples secured for preservation, these classes are now extinct. But from these early products of the modernisation plan, the seeds were sown for the construction of the Class 37s. These early Type 4 designs all suffered from the same basic problem. Their power-to-weight ratio was appalling. All of these machines consumed much of their own engine output in order to overcome the inertia caused by their own heavy weight, and as such were extremely sluggish in operation. So at this relatively late stage in the modernisation programme, the decision was reached that what was really needed was a general-purpose mixed traffic locomotive of lighter construction. In 1959, the first order was placed for what was, and still is, the largest fleet of Type 3 motive power on British railways. Initially, only 42 machines were ordered, but subsequent orders took the fleet total to 309, with the first locomotives being delivered during the winter of 1960 to 61. The English Electric Company received the contract for the new Type 3. Design and construction was undertaken at the company's Vulcan foundry at Newton-le-Willows, who eventually produced the majority of the locomotives. However, when capacity at Newton was stretched, certain small batches of locomotives were built at the premises of Robert, Stevenson and Hawthorns of Darlington. Regardless of origin, all locomotives were fitted from new with English Electric 12 CSVT power units. When new, the locomotives were numbered from D6700 upwards. Delivery was spread over a 5-year period and took the number series up to D6999. A small number of locomotives were not accommodated within this series and were subsequently numbered from D6600 to D6608 inclusive, thereby giving the unusual situation where the lowest numbered members of the class were not actually the class prototypes. The first 119 locomotives were built featuring the well-known split head code boxes and are referred to as Phase 1. The remainder were constructed with a redesigned front end and are known as Phase 2 locomotives. During the early 1970s, the class was renumbered under the British Rail Total Operations Processing System, TOPS for short, as Class 37, as shown. It was in East Anglia that the first examples of Class 37 were allocated during the last months of 1960. Initially, they replaced Britannia Pacifics on the Norwich and Clacton lines, and were for many years the standard passenger locomotive on the Great Eastern lines. Today, the class is still prolific in East Anglia, although their days as passenger locomotives are sadly almost at an end. The freightliner workings to and from the port of Felixstowe are regularly hauled by pairs of 37s. The North London line, together with the route from Ely to March, provide the two main freight links into East Anglia. Recently, the 37s have seen action on summer Saturday trains to the resorts of Skegness and Great Yarmouth. The refurbishment program discussed earlier coincided with the adoption of what was then intended to be the new standard rail freight locomotive livery. Early overhauls were outshopped in all-over grey with yellow ends and black cab surrounds. Subsequently, some locomotives had an orange stripe applied around the lower part of the body. Even this styling was particularly short-lived, and in October 1987, a new freight livery was unveiled featuring an attractive two-tone grey scheme with colourful subsector embellishments. This livery seems set to become the standard scheme for the rail freight division of British Rail for the foreseeable future. "37250 shunts a Speedlink coal network train at Neasden. The locomotive has been painted into the intermediate red stripe livery, but an unusual appearance is created by the omission of the large bodyside BR logo and its replacement by a much smaller version on the number 2 end cab side. The 37s are utilised on every region of BR. The line from Stoke to Derby sees them regularly on steel and coal traffic. As the class approaches its 30th year, it must be considered a remarkable tribute to the soundness of the design that the only withdrawals so far are to locomotives which have either suffered from fire or accident damage. These few withdrawn specimens have themselves guaranteed the longevity of certain other machines by providing a much-needed pool of spare parts. Whilst the refurbished members of the class would appear to have a sound future for many years to come, the fate of the unrefurbished examples is less clear. The introduction over the next few months of the first Class 60 freight locomotives will no doubt have long-term repercussions for the 37s. British Railways have already stated that 100 Class 60s will replace 240 existing locomotives, and it is expected that many of the remaining first-generation motive power classes will be severely reduced by these new arrivals. Whether the Class 37s will suffer from this programme remains to be seen. In the meantime, however, it's business as usual.